The house in Greenwich, Connecticut, sat at the end of a long, curved driveway lined with winter-bare maple trees and discreet ground lighting that made the place glow without announcing itself. The kind of lighting that didn't ask for attention, but assumed it. Guests had been arriving steadily since 6 o'clock. Black SUVs and polished sedans pulling up, valets moving efficiently, voices carrying soft laughter into the cold evening air. Inside, everything was warm, golden, controlled. Crystal glasses clinked lightly. Low music floated through the rooms. Instrumental jazz, tasteful enough not to interfere with conversation. The living room had been cleared of excess furniture to create space, and a long table near the windows held catered hors d'oeuvres arranged like artwork. The walls were decorated with framed abstract pieces, expensive but impersonal, chosen to signal taste rather than feeling. Evelyn Carter stood just inside the kitchen doorway, one hand resting lightly on the marble counter, watching people she barely knew move comfortably through the house she had lived in for 5 years. She had learned how to stand without being noticed. It wasn't something she remembered choosing. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, the way habits form when you repeat a small concession often enough that it stops feeling like surrender. She knew where to place herself, so she wouldn't interrupt conversations. She knew how to smile without asking for engagement. She knew how to listen without being invited to speak. Tonight, she wore a navy blue dress she had bought months earlier after standing in a department store fitting room, turning slightly from side to side, asking herself whether it looked appropriate. Not striking, not memorable, appropriate. She had chosen it because it wouldn't draw attention, because it would blend. Around her, other women wore dresses that announced themselves before their voices did. Deep reds, metallic silvers, confident blacks cut sharply at the shoulders or back. Their jewelry caught the light when they laughed. They stood close to their husbands, hands resting possessively on suit sleeves, as if each pair had arrived already complete. Evelyn adjusted the thin strap of her dress and stepped forward, lifting a tray of champagne flutes from the counter. This had not been her idea. The party was Daniel Carter's. Daniel had insisted. He had framed it as a celebration. His promotion, his new role, the expansion of his firm into a broader investment portfolio. He spoke about it in the language he used for everything else: momentum, positioning, optics. "You can't mark a moment like this quietly," he had said weeks earlier, already scrolling through his phone while she stood at the edge of the bed folding laundry. "People need to see where you're headed." Evelyn had suggested dinner. Just the two of them. Somewhere small. Somewhere where they could talk. Daniel had smiled then, the smile he used when he thought someone was being naive. "This isn't about us," he had said. "This is about perception." So the house filled with people who spoke about markets and acquisitions and who had opinions about schools their children would attend someday, though none of them had children old enough yet. They spoke in sentences that assumed agreement. They laughed in the spaces where laughter was expected. Evelyn moved among them quietly, offering glasses. "Thank you," someone said without looking at her. Another took a flute and turned away mid-sentence. She didn't mind. Or rather, she had learned not to. Being unnoticed was safer than being misjudged. Near the fireplace, Margaret Carter, Daniel's mother, stood with a group of women she had known for decades. Her posture was immaculate. Her posture the kind that suggested she had never once been unsure where she belonged in a room. When Evelyn approached with the tray, Margaret glanced at her dress, her hair, the absence of jewelry, and offered a small, polite smile. "You're busy tonight," Margaret said, her tone neutral. "I'm fine," Evelyn replied automatically. Margaret nodded, already turning back to her conversation. The exchange ended there. Evelyn stepped away, her grip tightening slightly around the stem of one of the glasses as she crossed into the dining room. She caught sight of Daniel across the space, surrounded by 3 men she recognized vaguely. partners maybe, or clients. He looked relaxed, confident. His suit was tailored perfectly, his cufflinks catching the light when he gestured. He laughed easily, the sound sharp and controlled. This was his world. He had built it carefully. Evelyn paused near the edge of the room, unsure whether to approach, then did anyway. She offered the tray. One of the men took a glass. "Thanks," he said, distracted. Daniel didn't look at her at first. When he did, it was brief. "Could you grab another bottle from the kitchen?" he asked, his voice low, as if this were a favor rather than an instruction. "There's catering staff," she began. "They're tied up," he said, his smile tightening just enough to communicate displeasure without saying it outright. "It'll just take a minute." She nodded. Evelyn returned to the kitchen, setting the tray down carefully. She opened a wine fridge and reached for a bottle, her fingers brushing cold glass. She took a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and exhaled slowly. From the dining room, voices carried more clearly here, bouncing slightly off the tile. "Once the paperwork is finalized, it's airtight," someone said. She recognized the voice. Andrew Klein, Daniel's attorney. He had been to the house before, always professional, always polite. The kind of man who spoke precisely, as if words were tools. "I don't want any loose ends," Daniel replied. "There won't be," Andrew said. "Everything's been moved gradually. No sudden shifts. No obvious red flags." Evelyn froze. She stood still, the bottle cradled in one arm, her other hand resting against the counter. "Does she know?" Andrew asked. Daniel let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Why would she? She trusts me." Andrew hummed thoughtfully. "Then this is the cleanest way. By the time she understands what's happened, there won't be much she can do." There was a pause. Glasses clinked. Evelyn stared at the granite countertop, its surface patterned with soft gray veins she had traced with her eyes countless times before. Her heartbeat seemed loud in her ears. She told herself she had misunderstood, that this was about a client, that she was jumping to conclusions. She picked up the bottle and returned to the dining room. No one noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured. No one noticed the way her smile didn't quite settle on her face the way it usually did. Conversation resumed around her, uninterrupted. An hour passed. Then Daniel tapped his glass. Once, twice. The sound cut through the room cleanly. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The music faded. Conversation slowed, then stopped. People turned toward him, smiling, expectant. This was what they had come for. A toast, an announcement, something polished. Evelyn stood near the kitchen doorway again, the space she had unconsciously claimed as neutral ground. Daniel found her with his eyes. For a brief second, something passed between them. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, calculation. "I want to say something important," he began. "Something I should have done a long time ago." The room was silent. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm, even, "I think it's time we stop pretending." Her name sounded strange spoken like that. Public, framed. "I want a divorce." The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor beneath her had shifted just enough to throw off balance. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The air felt thick, heavy, as if sound itself had weight now. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Someone else glanced at their phone. "I know this isn't how things are usually done," Daniel continued, "but honesty matters. And the truth is, I married you thinking you'd grow into this life." He gestured vaguely around him. "The house, the people. You didn't." Her face burned. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, in her ears. "You're comfortable being invisible," he said, "and I need someone who can stand beside me Not behind me. Margaret nodded once, slowly, as if this were confirmation rather than surprise. Andrew stepped forward, holding a slim folder. For clarity, he said, his tone professional, the house, the accounts, and all major assets are in Daniel's name. Evelyn shook her head. That's not. You signed the documents, Daniel interrupted. You always did. She remembered the papers. Refinancing, transfers, things she hadn't fully understood but trusted him with. I think it would be best if you left, Daniel said quietly, taking her arm. The guests parted as he guided her toward the front door. No one spoke. No one stopped them. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. And then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A dark sedan rolled forward slowly, deliberately, and stopped just short of the steps. Daniel paused. The driver's door opened. An older man stepped out, tall despite his age, wearing a coat that fit perfectly. He moved with a calm that suggested nothing in his life had ever required urgency. He looked at Evelyn, and then he spoke. That's enough. The older man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single word, enough, landed with a weight that felt physical, like pressure in the chest. Conversations didn't resume. No one moved. The night air held still around the open doorway, as if the house itself had paused to listen. Daniel loosened his grip on Evelyn's arm, without realizing he was doing it. His expression shifted, not to fear, not yet, but to irritation, the kind reserved for interruptions that weren't part of the plan. I'm sorry, Daniel said, stepping slightly forward, reclaiming space. This is a private matter. The man ignored him. His attention remained fixed on Evelyn, studying her face with the patience of someone who had waited a long time for answers. His eyes were sharp gray, alert in a way that didn't match his age. When he finally spoke again, his voice was even. Are you hurt? The question caught her off guard. Not what happened, not who is he, not why are you here. Just that. Evelyn shook her head slowly. She wasn't sure if it was true. She wasn't bleeding. Nothing was broken. But something inside her felt unsteady, as if the room had shifted and never quite settled back. I'm fine, she said automatically. The man nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. He turned then, finally, to Daniel. Let her go. Daniel's mouth tightened. You don't get to tell me what to do in my own house. The man's lips curved faintly, not in a smile. We'll see. The guests leaned closer, without meaning to. Phones stayed in pockets. No one wanted to be the first to miss whatever this was becoming. There was a sense, subtle but undeniable, that something had entered the room that didn't belong to the carefully managed evening Daniel had arranged. My name is Richard Hale, the man said, addressing the room as much as Daniel. And I'm here for her. A murmur rippled through the guests. Evelyn felt every pair of eyes return to her, assessing, recalculating. The sudden attention made her chest tighten. I don't know you, she said quietly. Richard inclined his head. That's fair. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a folded photograph. The paper looked old, softened at the edges from being handled too often. He held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it. The woman in the photograph had dark hair pulled back loosely, a familiar curve to her jaw, the same serious eyes Evelyn saw every morning in the mirror. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her breath caught. My daughter, Richard said, at about your age. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the photo. My mother's name was Laura, she said. Laura Bennett. Richard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, as if a long-held tension had eased by a fraction. She took her mother's maiden name when she left. The room felt smaller now. Closer. She died, Evelyn said, 6 years ago. I know, Richard replied. I was too late to make things right with her. I didn't intend to be too late again. Daniel let out a sharp laugh. This is ridiculous. You can't just show up and... I can, Richard said calmly. And I did. He gestured slightly toward the car. Two people stepped forward from the shadows near the driveway, a woman carrying a leather portfolio and a man with a slim briefcase. They moved with quiet efficiency, not hurried, not hesitant. Daniel's attorney, Andrew, shifted his weight. His eyes flicked briefly toward the newcomers, then back to Daniel. Something unreadable passed between them. Richard spoke again, his voice still measured. Evelyn, I've been aware of you for some time. She looked at him, confusion warring with exhaustion. I didn't want to disrupt your life without understanding it, he continued. So I observed, from a distance. The woman with the portfolio stepped forward. We documented your routines, your work at the local library on Thursdays, your volunteer shifts at the food pantry twice a month, your habit of leaving meals on the steps for the older man who sleeps near the commuter station. Evelyn flushed. That's not. It matters, Richard said gently. Character always does. Daniel's jaw tightened. You had my wife followed. Protected, Richard corrected, and informed. The man with the briefcase opened it and removed a stack of documents. He didn't hand them over yet. He simply held them, waiting. This is harassment, Daniel said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. And defamation. Richard turned to him fully now. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For 3 years, Richard said, you transferred joint assets into sole accounts. You refinanced property under false pretenses. You forged signatures. Andrew took a half step back. That's a serious accusation, Daniel said. It's a statement of fact, Richard replied, and it's documented. The front of the house filled with flashing blue and red light as police vehicles pulled up the curb. The effect was immediate. Phones appeared then, though no one dared to raise them fully. A few guests edged toward the door, suddenly remembering early mornings, long drives, obligations elsewhere. Daniel stared at the lights, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation. This was supposed to be private, he said, almost to himself. Evelyn watched him from a distance that felt suddenly vast. She thought of the kitchen counter, the cold granite beneath her palm earlier that evening. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, brief and sharp. She was sitting at the same counter months ago, sunlight spilling across the surface. Daniel had slid a stack of papers toward her, already clipped neatly together. Just routine, he'd said, distracted, checking his phone. It's easier if everything's streamlined. She had hesitated, pen hovering. Trust me, he'd added, not looking up. The pen touched paper. The memory didn't resolve. It cut off there, unfinished, leaving the way to what followed to settle heavier in the present. The police officers approached the front door. Richard stepped slightly aside, giving them room. I called ahead, he said. They're expecting us. Daniel turned to Evelyn then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time that night. Something flickered across his face. Panic, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the room was no longer under his control. This doesn't change anything, he said quietly. You signed everything. Evelyn didn't answer. She stood still, the photograph still folded in her hand, feeling something unfamiliar take shape beneath the shock and exhaustion. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief. It was clarity. The officers stepped inside, and the night, carefully staged just hours earlier, began to unravel. The first police officer crossed the threshold with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to absorb the emotions of the rooms he entered. His presence changed the air immediately. Conversations didn't resume. They didn't need to. The room had crossed into a different category of reality, one where performance no longer mattered. Evening. The officer said calmly, "We receive a call." Richard Hale stepped forward, already holding a slim folder. He didn't rush. He didn't explain more than necessary. He handed the documents over with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed. Daniel stood near the staircase now, his back straight, his expression carefully controlled. He watched the exchange with the tight focus of a man calculating angles, not outcomes. "This is unnecessary," Daniel said. "There's been a misunderstanding." The second officer glanced at him briefly, then back at the paperwork. "Sir, we'll determine that." Evelyn remained near the doorway, her coat still hanging untouched on the rack beside her. She hadn't moved since the lights first appeared outside. Movement felt optional now. For the first time all evening, nothing was being asked of her. The guests had begun to drift away in small, quiet groups. No goodbyes, no lingering, just a subtle retreat of people who didn't want their names attached to whatever this had become. The sound of heels against hardwood echoed briefly, then faded. The house, once filled with voices, fell hollowed out. Margaret Carter stood near the fireplace, her posture rigid. She watched the officers with visible displeasure, arms folded tightly across her chest. "This is absurd," she said. "My son would never." "Margaret," Daniel cut in sharply. She fell silent, her lips pressing into a thin line. The officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, we'll need you to come with us." Daniel laughed then, not loudly, not humorously. It was a short, incredulous sound. "For what?" "For questioning," the officer replied evenly. "Regarding alleged financial misconduct." Daniel's eyes flicked to Andrew. Andrew didn't meet his gaze. Evelyn noticed that before she noticed anything else. The way Andrew adjusted his tie, the way his shoulders angled slightly away from Daniel now, as if distance might become useful. "I've done nothing wrong," Daniel said. "Everything was legal." "Then this will be resolved quickly," the officer said. Richard remained silent. The man with the briefcase stepped forward at Richard's subtle nod and placed it on the dining table. He opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing neatly organized files, bank statements, property records, timelines. Evelyn felt a strange attachment settle over her as she watched the officers flip through pages. She recognized some of the addresses, the refinance paperwork, the account names, things that had once seemed abstract, administrative. Andrew swallowed. "These documents appear to indicate irregularities," he said carefully, choosing each word as if it might later be examined under a microscope. Daniel's composure cracked then, just slightly. "This is harassment," he said again, louder this time. "You can't just take my word over." "I'm not taking anyone's word," the officer interrupted. "I'm reviewing evidence." Margaret took a step forward. "This family has a reputation." Richard finally looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it does." The officers finished their initial review. One nodded to the other. "Mr. Carter," he said, "please place your hands behind your back." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was quieter than Evelyn expected. It was also final. Daniel stiffened, his face flushing with anger and something else she had never seen on it before. Fear. He turned toward Evelyn, his eyes searching her face for something: support, protest, denial. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said to her. "This will ruin everything." She looked at him. For years, she had searched his face for cues, for permission to speak, for reassurance that she hadn't misstepped. She had learned his moods, his silences, the way his approval could be withdrawn without explanation. Now she saw something else entirely. "You already ruined it," she said quietly. The words surprised her with their steadiness. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say that would restore the control he had lost. As the officers guided him toward the door, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. She was standing in the same living room, years earlier, surrounded by boxes on moving day. Daniel had wrapped an arm around her shoulders, smiling broadly as he spoke to the realtor. "She's incredible," he'd said, squeezing her gently. "Couldn't do any of this without her." The realtor had laughed. Lucky man. Evelyn remembered the warmth of that moment, the way she had leaned into him, believing the words because she wanted to. The memory fractured there, collapsing under the weight of the present. Daniel was led past her without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Andrew followed shortly after, escorted by another officer. He didn't look back. Margaret remained standing, her face pale, her composure finally slipping. She looked at Evelyn then, really looked at her, as if trying to reconcile the woman she had dismissed for years with the center of the night's collapse. "This didn't have to happen," Margaret said stiffly. Evelyn said nothing. Richard stepped closer, his presence steady, unintrusive. "You don't have to stay here," he said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever, if you don't want to." Evelyn looked around the room. The furniture Daniel had chosen, the art she had never liked but never questioned, the house that had felt less like a home with every passing year. "I don't want anything from this place," she said. Richard nodded. "Then take nothing." She retrieved her coat from the rack and slipped it on. As she did, her hand brushed the inside pocket, where the folded photograph still rested. She hadn't realized she'd kept it. They walked out together into the cold night. The police cars were gone now, their lights taking Daniel somewhere she didn't intend to follow. Evelyn paused at the bottom of the steps and looked back once. The house stood quiet, illuminated, empty. For the first time, it felt small. The car moved away from the house without urgency, its tires barely whispering against the asphalt as the gate closed behind them. Evelyn watched the lights recede to the rear window until the road curved and the property disappeared entirely. She expected something sharp to arrive then, relief maybe or anger, but what settled instead was a muted emptiness, like a room after furniture has been removed. Richard sat in the front passenger seat, angled slightly toward her, not speaking. He understood silence. The driver kept his eyes on the road. They crossed out of Greenwich and into darker stretches where streetlights thinned and trees pressed closer to the pavement. The quiet felt deliberate, protective. Evelyn rested her forehead briefly against the cool glass, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the sensation of motion. They arrived at Richard's estate just after midnight. The property unfolded gradually, iron gates opening onto a long drive, lights placed low and wide, illuminating without glare. The house itself wasn't imposing in the way Evelyn expected. It was large, certainly, but restrained. Old money restraint. Stone wood warmth. A smaller structure sat set back from the main house, lights already on inside. "That's the guest house," Richard said as the car came to a stop. "It's yours for as long as you want it. No expectations." Evelyn nodded. She wasn't ready to ask questions. She wasn't ready to decide anything beyond the next few minutes. Inside, the guest house was simple and complete. A living area with soft furniture, a small kitchen, a bedroom with clean lines and no excess. Someone had anticipated comfort without assuming intimacy. Richard stopped near the door. "I'll be in the main house if you need anything. Rest." She watched him leave, the door closing gently behind him. Evelyn stood alone for a long moment, coat still on, purse still in hand. Then she set the purse down, removed her coat, and sat on the edge of the bed. The quiet pressed in, and with it came memory, not one moment, but many, arriving without order, compressing years into fragments. She saw herself at the dining table, laptop open, asking Daniel if he could explain a document she didn't understand. His sigh, the way he'd lean back, eyes narrowing just enough to communicate impatience. "It's basic," he'd said. "You're overthinking it." She saw herself at a dinner party months earlier, reaching for a comment in conversation, only to feel Daniel's hand tighten around her knee beneath the table. A warning. She'd smiled and gone silent. She saw mornings when she'd woken early to make coffee before he left, afternoons when she rearranged her schedule to accommodate his, evenings when she practiced sentences in her head and then swallowed them. None of it had felt like abuse at the time. It had felt like adjustment, compromise, marriage. The memories didn't linger individually. They overlapped, stacked, blurred together until the pattern became unmistakable. She had been shrinking for years, slowly enough that it felt like normal. Evelyn pressed her palms against her knees and inhaled deeply. In the morning, sunlight filled the room gently, filtered through tall trees outside the window. She woke without an alarm, disoriented for a moment, then remembered everything at once. The house, the guests, the handcuffs, Richard. She showered, changed into borrowed clothes laid out neatly on a chair, and stepped outside. The air smelled of damp earth and early spring. Somewhere nearby, birds moved through branches. Richard was already awake, seated at a small table on the terrace of the main house, a mug in his hands. He looked up as she approached. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. It was enough. They sat together in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. "There will be questions," Richard said eventually, "from investigators, from attorneys. You don't have to face any of it alone." She nodded. "There's something else," he continued. "Daniel's accounts are frozen pending review. The house will be considered marital property again once the fraud is fully established." Evelyn listened without reacting. The information registered, but it didn't anchor her. "Not yet. I don't want it," she said after a moment. "I don't want any of it." Richard studied her carefully. "That's your decision. You won't be pressured." Later that day, she walked the grounds alone. The estate was expansive but lived in, paths worn by use rather than display. She found a small garden tucked away near the tree line, soil freshly turned, seedlings just beginning to show. She knelt, touching the earth lightly with her fingers. Another memory surfaced then, quieter, almost forgotten. She was younger, sitting on the floor of a small apartment, paintbrush in hand, working on a canvas propped against the wall. Daniel had come in, glanced at it briefly. "You're good," he'd said, "but it's not practical." She'd laughed then, embarrassed, and set the brush down. The memory ended there. Evelyn stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. She returned to the guest house and unpacked a few things she brought with her. At the bottom of her purse, beneath receipts and a folded scarf, she found a small notebook. She hadn't opened it in years. That evening, Richard knocked lightly on the door. "I have a meeting with my attorneys tomorrow," he said. "You're welcome to join if you want. Or not." She considered. The old instinct was to decline, to avoid inconvenience. "Yes," she said instead. "I'd like to be there." Richard smiled just slightly. "Good." As night settled again over the estate, Evelyn sat at the small desk in the guest house, notebook open in front of her. She picked up a pen and hesitated. Then she began to write, not explanations, not plans, just observations, questions, thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to articulate before. Outside, the house stood quiet and steady. Inside, something fragile and new was beginning to take shape. The conference room overlooked the river, its windows stretching from floor to ceiling, letting in a pale morning light that softened the edges of everything it touched. The table was long, polished, and empty except for neatly arranged folders at each seat. Evelyn took one of the chairs near the middle. placing her hands flat on the surface as if to steady herself. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but attentive. Two attorneys occupied seats to his right, their expressions composed, professional. Across from them sat a forensic accountant and an investigator, both with laptops open, screens already alive with data. No one rushed. They began with timelines. The investigator spoke first, his voice even. The earliest irregularity we identified dates back to 3 years ago. A restructuring of joint assets under pretense of tax efficiency. He clicked a remote. A document appeared on the screen. Behind him, dates, signatures, numbers. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, recognizing the heading. She remembered the evening Daniel had brought that paper home, smiling casually, mentioning a colleague's advice. She remembered signing it without reading past the first page. The accountant continued. From there, accounts were slowly decoupled. Nothing abrupt. That's why it avoided detection for so long. Another click. Property records appeared. Transfers. Refinances. All staggered carefully, spaced just far enough apart to look coincidental. Richard listened without interruption. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, not with shock, but with a quiet, cold understanding. A memory surfaced then, sharp and precise. Daniel stood in the doorway of their bedroom. Sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. "You trust me, right?" he'd asked lightly, flipping through papers. "This stuff gets complicated. It's better if one of us handles it." She nodded, relieved to be spared the confusion. The memory shifted. A second moment. Daniel laughing softly at dinner with friends. "Evelyn doesn't worry about these things," he'd said fondly. "She lets me take care of it." She remembered the warmth of being spoken about kindly, not realizing how much control had been folded into the sentence. The flashback collapsed there, the present reclaiming space. "This wasn't impulsive," the investigator said. "It was planned, methodical." The words settled over the room. Richard finally spoke. "And the timing of the public divorce." The investigator nodded, calculated, based on asset consolidation completion. The event itself would have served as emotional destabilization, making resistance less likely. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. She saw the party again. The guests, the glass in Daniel's hand, the way he'd said her name. "I want a divorce." It hadn't been anger. It had been certainty. "This was never about incompatibility," Richard said quietly. "It was about removal." No one contradicted him. The meeting ended without ceremony. Decisions were made efficiently. Actions outlined. There was no dramatic language, no raised voices. The damage had already been done. Now it was simply being acknowledged. Outside, the sky had brightened. Evelyn walked alone along the path beside the river, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The water moved steadily, indifferent to what had unfolded in rooms overlooking it. Later that afternoon, she sat with Richard in his study. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that looked read, not decorative. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wood. "There's something I want you to know," Richard said. "What happens next will be public. There will be coverage, opinions, speculation." She nodded. She had already imagined it. The headlines, the quiet curiosity of strangers. "You don't have to participate in any of it," he continued. "You can remain private, or you can speak. The choice is yours." Evelyn considered. For years, she had been spoken for, spoken about, defined by silence. "I'll testify," she said finally, "not to punish him, to tell the truth." Richard inclined his head. "That's enough." The trial date was set quickly. The evidence left little room for negotiation. Daniel's attorneys attempted delays, motions, technical challenges. None held. On the morning of the first hearing, Evelyn arrived early. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters, cameras angled toward the entrance. She moved past them without stopping, her pace steady. Inside, the courtroom was quiet, formal. Wood and stone. Authority without drama. Daniel sat at the defense table, his suit impeccable, his expression controlled. When he saw her, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the realization that she was no longer behind him, but opposite. She took her seat and waited. When she was called to testify, she stood, walked forward, and placed her hand on the Bible. The oath was administered. Her voice did not shake when she spoke. She described the documents, the trust, the way decisions had been framed. She didn't editorialize. She didn't accuse. She simply answered questions. Daniel watched her closely, as if searching for the woman who used to defer, who used to soften sentences before speaking them. She didn't appear. As the proceedings continued, evidence unfolded in clean, chronological order. The forged signatures, the account transfers, the pattern impossible to ignore. Daniel's composure eroded gradually, not dramatically. His shoulders slumped. His jaw tightened. He stopped taking notes. At one point, their eyes met. For the first time, Evelyn saw something like comprehension in his expression, not remorse, not apology, understanding. He had misjudged her. The realization arrived too late to change anything. When court adjourned for the day, Evelyn exited through a side door, avoiding the cameras. Richard waited outside, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You did well," he said. "I told the truth," she replied. That evening, alone again in the guest house, Evelyn sat by the window as dusk settled over property. She thought of the life she had lived so carefully, so quietly, the years spent adapting, the moments she had mistaken endurance for virtue. The punishment was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was complete. The house was quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but settled. Evelyn stood by the window of the guest house, watching light move slowly across the lawn as the sun rose higher. The world continued without acknowledgement of what had ended, and for the first time, that felt appropriate. Life was not rushing to congratulate her. It was simply continuing. 3 months passed, not dramatically, not ceremoniously. Time moved forward in ordinary increments, days marked by routine, weeks by small decisions, progress measured less by milestones and by subtle internal shifts. Evelyn found herself waking without the familiar knot of anticipation in her chest. She no longer rehearsed conversations before having them. Silence was no longer something she filled to make others comfortable. She spent mornings walking the grounds, afternoons reading in the small study Richard had insisted she use if she wanted privacy. He never entered without knocking, never asked questions she didn't volunteer answers to. The legal proceedings progressed in the background, efficiently and without spectacle. Daniel's name appeared in business sections, framed in language that avoided adjectives. The facts were enough. Associates distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. A world that had once moved easily around him adjusted without ceremony. Evelyn read about it only once. She didn't save the article. She had begun taking classes online, finance, ethics, contract law, not because anyone suggested it, but because she wanted to understand. She wanted to know exactly what words meant before she agreed to them. Knowledge, she was learning, was not power in itself, but it prevented quiet theft. Richard watched her progress with interest, but no interference. When she asked questions, he answered them. When she disagreed, he listened. One afternoon, they sat across from each other at the long table in his study, documents spread between them. Evelyn traced a paragraph with her finger. "This clause," she said, "it looks neutral, but it shifts responsibility quietly." Richard smiled. "It does." She looked up. Why would anyone agree to it? Because it's framed as convenience, he replied, and because people trust those who speak confidently. Evelyn nodded. The answer felt complete. Later that evening, alone again, she found herself standing in front of a mirror she had passed countless times without looking into. She studied her reflection carefully, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. A memory surfaced then, gentle and brief. She was younger, standing in a bookstore aisle, holding a novel against her chest. She remembered the feeling of possibility, of choosing something simply because it interested her. No justification required. The memory didn't resolve into nostalgia. It didn't ache. It simply existed. Evelyn stepped back from the mirror and turned away. The trial concluded quietly. The sentence was handed down in measured language. There were no cameras in the courtroom that day, no commentary. Daniel stood as the decision was read, his face composed, his posture rigid. When it ended, he did not look toward her. She did not look toward him. That chapter closed without sound. On a cool evening weeks later, Evelyn sat at the small desk in the guest house, painting. Watercolor spread across the page in controlled strokes. She had returned to it slowly, without expectation. The act felt grounding, intentional. Hers. Richard appeared in the doorway, pausing until she noticed him. "I have a board meeting tomorrow," he said. "You're welcome to join. No pressure to speak." Evelyn considered. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to observe." The next morning, she wore a tailored jacket she had chosen herself, fitted properly instead of accepted as close enough. She noticed the difference immediately. It wasn't about appearance. It was about decision. At the meeting, she listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, her voice was steady, not loud, not apologetic. Afterward, one of the board members approached her. "You have good instincts," he said. "You should trust them." She nodded once. "I am." That night, walking the grounds again, Evelyn stopped near the edge of the garden. The soil had been turned again. New growth had appeared where she remembered bare earth. She knelt briefly, brushing her fingers over the leaves. Another memory surfaced, this one quieter than the others. She stood in the doorway of the old house months ago, coat half on, Daniel's hand gripping her arm. Guests watching. Silence heavy. The memory didn't hurt now. It simply reminded her of where she had stopped disappearing. Evelyn stood, brushing her hands clean. Inside the house, the grandfather clock chimed softly, marking the hour. She gathered her things for the evening and turned off the light in the guest house, locking the door behind her. The space had served its purpose. Tomorrow, she would move into a place of her own, somewhere smaller, somewhere chosen, not hidden, not borrowed, hers. As she walked toward the main house, Richard looked up from the table where he sat reading. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it.